My name is Gary GIBSON. I'm a lieutenant here at TCFR. Today we're going to learn about this ventry fan, which is a 20 GX160. By the end of this, we're going to fill out this attendance sheet right here. We're also going to take a written test. We're going to take an oral test, and then we're going to go out on the deck. We're going to do a couple of skills, how to start and stop the fan safely, and go over some maintenance items. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me and we will answer those as we go along. So the specifications of this fan, this is a GX160. It has a Honda motor on it. It's 4.8 horsepower. It's an air-cooled 4-stroke motor, meaning that the gasoline is held in a separate compartment than the oil. This has a single-barrel butterfly carburetor. It holds just over a half quart of oil, 0.61 quarts of oil, and you can see the reservoir down here on the bottom. It displaces 163 cubic centimeters. It's got a 3.3 quart fuel capacity. It takes 87 of regular octane gas, and runtime is about 2 hours. So the propeller is an aircraft grade piece of wood that is shaped and then has epoxy sprayed over the outer coating of it. This is a high CFM. It's designed to be durable in the event that you have to run the fan with the legs not extended. And it has an oil cutoff switch, meaning if you tip it over, the fan will stop running. It displaces 17,300 CFM of air per minute, and it's measured with the fan's legs extended, so with air moving beneath the fan cage. Like I said, it runs for about 2 hours on 3.3 quarts of fuel, and it weighs about 66 pounds. So this is the cutaway of what's inside that motor. You can see that it's got 2 separate fuel filters in the tank. It's got a forged tempered crankshaft that rides on a ball bearing on both ends. It's got overhead valves on the single cylinder that's here with a cast iron cylinder liner. And it's got a single spark plug with an electronic ignition system. And right here you can see the air cleaner assembly. So translating that over to real life again, gas tank on top. The gas tank cap has a chain that permanently attaches it so you can't lose it. This is the air cleaner, which is held on by a wing nut. That's the spark plug. This is the pull start. Right here we have the throttle lever. This is the choke lever. That's the fuel. And this over here is the on-off selector switch. So this is the exploded diagram, and this is part of what's in the manual that you guys have. So you can see all of the different torque specifications for this and how this thing comes apart and is put back together. So there should be no questions. If you ever have to disassemble this thing, you've got a reference. This is also online in addition to the paper copy that you guys will get. So the valve train components is what we're going to look at next, because we're going to talk about valve lash adjustment. This is the cylinder head looking from the top down. These two right here are the rocker arms. Those are the rocker arm retaining cups. This is the rocker arm retaining nuts. That's the adjuster nut, and that's the lock nut. This is the plate that these 2 push rods and valves ride in. This is the springs, and this is the gasket. You can see it. It just roughly resembles the basic shape of that cylinder head. So why is valve adjustment important? You need to check and adjust the valve clearance because these components, they wear over time as we run the fan, and it may fall out of adjustment. If it's out of range, it results in excessive wear. It makes a bunch of noise. It doesn't work effectively, lost performance, or it'll just be noisy and eventually it'll cause it to fail. So proper valve adjustment is an important and frequent maintenance requirement on all small overhead valve engines. Refer to your operator's manual, which is a piece of that exploded diagram that we just looked at. So the adjustment interval, how often do we do this? Adjustment interval on most models every year or 200 to 300 hours. For you guys, because this is a piece of equipment that goes on a fire apparatus, I would look at it more often than that. And then you'll also need to know the valve tolerances, and again, that can be found in the online manual or the paper copy. So in order to do this, you have to find top dead center. And top dead center, all that means is that the piston is all the way at the top of the cylinder head. And to find top dead center, what we do is remove the spark plug using a spark plug socket, take a screwdriver with a marker, and then rotate manually the fan blades around and look inside the cylinder bore with a flashlight. When we find top dead center, stick a screwdriver in there and mark the screwdriver and just rotate it again and make sure that it's all the way at top dead center. There's two methods to do this. One is the starter pulley. You can actually pull the starter handle that's on the fan and rotate it that way, like this, or you can use the spark plug and screwdriver method like we just discussed. And you guys will get to do all this stuff out in the field. So adjusting the valve lash. So the valve to rocker arm clearance should be checked or adjusted after every 200 to 300 hours of operation. To adjust the valve clearance, remove the rocker arm cover, rotate the crankshaft in a normal direction so that the piston is at top dead center, using the procedure that we just described. Insert a feeler gauge in between the rocker arm and the end of the valve stem, loosen the rocker arm jam nut, and turn the adjusting nut to obtain the desired clearance. So the clearance for this is 0.15 millimeters or 0.006 inches. For intake, and then 0.20 millimeters or 0.008 inches for exhaust. So after that's done, tighten the jam nut and recheck the clearance, install your rocker arm cover, and then go ahead and go through the procedure and you can check it. And you can see right here on the bottom, that intake valve clearance and the exhaust valve clearance, those specs are right there. They're also in that online manual again, or on the paper copy. The rocker arm torque spec, as you can see here, it's 7 foot-pounds of torque, which is not very much. So use a torque wrench. Don't over tighten this thing. You can cause some damage or premature wear if you over tighten it. So shown here, this is the feeler gauge, and it's just like a pack of little metal shims, little sticks, and they're actually checking the tolerance between the rocker arm itself and the top of the valve stem there. And again, you guys will get to do that once we go outside. So the carburetor diagram, this is a closer view. The carburetor, that's an exploded diagram of what this thing looks like inside. This includes all the gaskets, the springs, and the screws. On the bottom here, which is the part that you guys probably need to familiarize yourselves with the most, is the fuel bowl gasket, the float, and then the needle and seat. So the reason that we would need to remove that fuel bowl, either in the field or just for normal maintenance, is because over time, that fuel float that's in the carburetor bowl, it may wear out. The spring seat on the needle may become have less resistance in it, and it may not return the float to its normal level. So that may have to be changed out. So all it takes to remove this fuel bowl is a 10 millimeter socket or a box wrench. And there's 3 nuts that are holding the carb cover and the carb itself, which are also 10 millimeter. You would remove the carb. You can also do this as it sits on the fan. You can drain the fuel bowl. There's 2 separate nuts. And you can see here the one that's angled out at about a 45-degree angle. That one is the drain. And this one on the very bottom that points down at the ground, that one is how you remove the fuel bowl. All of these carbs come pre-adjusted. You don't need to adjust them. If we're going to replace it, we just take it off with those 3 nuts and then replace it. The flooded carb or the fuel bowl drain. So we would use a 10 millimeter socket to remove that drain nut, positioned at a 45-degree angle. Don't remove the center nut. That's what holds that bowl on. You would only need to do that to remove the float. So drain it out, turn the fuel off, make sure that's done before you drain it out, and then just replace that nut. Again, it doesn't need to be very tight. Just make sure it's quarter turn past finger tight. So the carb bowl removal, if we're going to remove it entirely, all you do, again, a 10 millimeter wrench, stick it right on that one that points straight at the ground, remove it. So the carb bowl is removed in order to verify that the float is operating correctly. It should have some spring tension that kind of holds it in place. And then because it's air-filled, it is buoyant. It's kind of made out of almost the same material that a ping pong ball is made out of. It fills the carb bowl by opening a needle valve when the float moves below a certain level. If the float is stuck, it will either overfill the bowl and float the carb or stick in the upwards position and then starve the engine of fuel because no fuel is getting past it. So there's another picture right there where the cursor is. You can see the bowl nut, and that's how you remove that entire fuel bowl. So checking the float should move up and down freely. If it's stuck, if it hangs up, if it's got any pinholes in it, it needs to be replaced. Typically, you're going to replace the needle valve and the float body itself as a pair. While you're in there, you might as well do both. So there's a picture right here of the fuel bowl that's been removed. And then if you'll notice in the picture, the needle valve, it's got a little rubber tip on it. And so if anything gets clogged up, if that rubber tip deteriorates over time, it's not going to operate as it should. So let's talk about the needle valve. The needle valve itself is machined to a fine tolerance to deliver a precise amount of fuel into that fuel bowl. The needle valve is spring-loaded and has a rubber tip to seal the bowl from the inlet. It only lets fuel in when the fuel level in the bowl is low and the float is in the downward position. That rubber tip, the gasoline, because it's got chemicals in it, petroleum products, over time it just damages that little rubber tip and fuel will leak past that little rubber tip. The spring in the retainer can become damaged, weaken over time. So there's a picture of the spring right there. Again, it doesn't have a ton of tension on it, but it's just enough to hold that valve shut when there's fuel in the bowl. So the carb jets, fuel sprayed through these tiny holes in the carb thread by the main jet and the emulsion tube. And here you can see it looks kind of like a little flute, and it's got all these fine little holes that are drilled in the carb, and then here's the main jet down on the bottom. That can be clogged or become damaged over time. So fuel delivery is metered by jets specifically sized for the application. The specification for that particular carb jet is in the manual. We'll have to replace it with one of the same part numbers. So to remove the carb jet and replace it, this is much like the removing the fuel bowl to replace the float and the needle. So remove the fuel bowl, and you can see the float right here, this little white horseshoe-shaped object. With a thin, straight slot screwdriver, remove the stock main jet. The emulsion tube will follow the main jet. If the emulsion tube doesn't come out, just tap the side of the carburetor and it should just fall right out. Put your new emulsion tube and your main jet back in the same order. The main jet goes on the bottom. Right there you can see the tip of the screwdriver that's in that tube. So the carb inlet, if you've got poorly running engine, it's not running right, rather than replacing this thing, something that we can do is remove those 3 nuts, and then you can look at the main air bleed hole or the pilot or the idle bleed hole and just make sure there's no gunk in there or oil that's passed through there. This one normally has a set screw for the choke that's in it. You'll have to mark the position of it so that it can be put back in the proper position. Again, we're just basically checking for cleanliness at this point to make sure that it's not clogged up. So the last thing is the oil change. So the method in which this is done, the fan's got to be upright. We're going to remove one of the drain plugs. There's one on either side of the crankcase. We're going to drain the oil out. It's just regular 10W30 motor oil, nothing fancy. And we're going to fill that using a measuring cup to 0.61 quarts. And you can see here on the bottom of the diagram your oil level where it should be. So here is the threaded portion where your dipstick goes in there, and it should just be almost at the level of the lip of that little threaded portion where the dipstick goes in there. So that's going to conclude the PowerPoint portion of this presentation. At this point, we're going to pass around the attendance sheet, make sure everybody's here. Then we're going to administer the written tests. We'll do the oral tests, then we'll go outside and do the skills tests.